A proportion is a statement that two ratios are equal. A proportion is also a special type of equation. Well, we better review what's a ratio. It's a comparison of two numbers, and here's an example. 2 to 5. You may write it like this. Ratios are often written with colons. It's still pronounced 2 to 5. And they're written as fractions. For our purposes, we're going to use the fraction way. In this case, 2 over 5. So here's a proportion. We have a ratio, 2 over 5, is equal to another ratio, n over 13. But the second ratio has a variable. So our job is to find out what number replaces the variable to make this proportion true. Well, we can use the rules we've already learned. So I'm choosing to multiply both sides by 32. And I'm marking out the 32 over 32 on the right. I'm doing the arithmetic on the left to get 64/5 is equal to n. Well, then I'm going to multiply both sides by 5. And that's going to give me that 64 equals 5n. Then I'm going to divide both sides by 5, and in this case, leave the answer as a decimal, 12.8. Well, let's compare line 1 to line 3. In line 1, you'll notice the green ovals that I've circled, and I've circled the 2 and the 32, which are diagonal from one another in the proportion, and also the 5 and the n. Some of you may recognize this with a term that's often used, cross-multiplying. Notice in line 3, it's 64, but that's what 2 times 32 is. And also in line 3, we have 5n. That brings us to a formal statement of what cross-multiplying is. It's called the means extremes property, and it states that in a proportion, the product of the means is equal to the product of the extremes. Or for real numbers a, b, c, and d, where b and d are not 0, if a over b is equal to c over d, then a times d is equal to b times c. But perhaps we need a couple more definitions. Means and extremes. Well, you've probably heard these words before, but in a proportion, such as this one, the b and c are called the means, and the a and the d are called the extremes. So back to our first proportion, we'll use the means extremes property to solve this proportion with fewer steps. We circle our diagonal means and extremes, the 2 and the 32, the extremes, the 5 and the n, the means, and the product of the means, 5 times n, is equal to the product of the extremes, 2 times 32. We then do 2 times 32, we divide by 5, and we get that n is 12.8. Here's another proportion. We should get that 9 times 12 is equal to x times 25. Or in this case, we wrote 25x is equal to 9 times 12, which is the same thing. We do 9 times 12, we divide by 25, and we get that x is 4.32. Another example. The x is in a denominator, but 8 times 11 is going to be equal to 42 times x. We chose to write the 42x first. We do the 8 times 11, we divide by 42. We put it in lowest terms, and we get 44 over 21. Here's a little more complicated proportion, but it's still a proportion. The entire expression 8n plus 2 is one of the extremes, and the entire expression 4n minus 5 is one of the means. So here's our product of the means and the extremes. It involves the distributive property. And before we do that, we'll apply the definition of subtraction, then the distributive property. And while we're not showing work, we're going to add 25 to both sides, and we're going to also add negative 24n to both sides to get that negative 4n is 31. We're dividing both sides by negative 4, and our solution is that n is equal to negative 7.75. Here's one. Doesn't look like a proportion, but the number 63 can be turned into a ratio by putting a 1 on the bottom, because 63 over 1 is equal to 63. Now we can apply our property. And since there's a 1 involved, we have 1 times the quantity 8n plus 2, and of course 5 times 63. And 5 times 63 is 315. We add negative 2 to both sides to get 313. We divide both sides by 8. Our solution, 39.125. And in our final example, we have an entire expression on the right. We can put that over 1 to turn it into a ratio. Then we can do 5 times the quantity, 6n minus 4 on the right, and 8n times 1 on the left. We do the multiplications using the distributive property. We apply the definition of subtraction. Then we add negative 30n to both sides to get that negative 22n is equal to negative 20. We divide both sides by negative 22, and it's negative divided by negative to give us a final answer of n is equal to 10/11. To summarize, the means extremes property states that in a proportion, the product of the means is equal to the product of the extremes. And when solving an equation that is a proportion, using this property may save time.